ladies and gentlemen, I would love to welcome our guest for this particular LeaderSHIFT conversation. One that I tell you one thing, you're in for quite a treat with Pratt. She's the author of the upcoming book, Mandela Leadership Blueprint. And also more than anything else, actually, she is based in the United States and was a Harvard Fellow, one of 45 top leaders worldwide, a multi-award businesswoman, as well as International Women's Forum member, and completed an MBA at one of South Africa's leading business schools, a postgraduate degree in psychology, majoring in economics and psychology, and leading a South African university. But I'm going to speak to you a little bit about this because this is particularly important as we are a Nelson Mandela month. The 18th of July, of course, we celebrated International Nelson Mandela Day. So Anne Pratt is the author of the upcoming book, Mandela's Leadership Blueprint, which obviously is an urgent response to the pivotal global moment that the world's leadership crisis actually needs to be able to address. So ladies and gentlemen, with that, help me welcome Anne Pratt to this LeaderSHIFT conversation. As I said, Anne, it is such a treat to be in your company, particularly it's such a pivotal moment of leadership where the question of leadership actually comes into mind. And of course, after we've just celebrated International Mandela Day. So very warm welcome to you, Anne, and welcome to LeaderSHIFT.
Thank you so much, Faith. And it's such an honor and a joy to be part of this conversation. Of course, happy 105th birthday to Madiba, and welcome to this community of people who care about change in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we go into the work you do, and also we're going to tackle a little bit, and we're going to deep dive when it comes to leadership, but let's start from the other side of it, because you're not just Anne, the author and the leader and the businesswoman, you're also Anne, who is a family member, and you've got a personal life. Let's talk a little bit about Anne, the personality.
Yeah, well, Faith, I'm a proud bred and born South African. I grew up in an anti-apartheid family. My late grandmother was a pioneer. She was a Master of Science. She headed up Johannesburg Town Planning Department when she was 50 years old. My mother pioneered Black medical education in South Africa and taught at King Edward Hospital and RK Khan, and then went on to teach at Gray's, etc. So I grew up in a family that were followed by state police for 8 years. We had policemen at the end of our driveway because my mother sat down and taught us as children that at no point would any government or any authority figure dictate to us who in life we get to connect with, we get to learn from, and we get to embrace. And I remember as a young child praying for the day that Mandela would be released and praying for the day I would meet him. And that prayer and that dream came true. So those early days definitely shaped me significantly. I was educated in South Africa. I had a very privileged career. And then I had one of my big dreams fulfilled. And in fact, Mandela played a role in that. I met him for the first time, in fact, on Women's Day, in August 2003 at the Johannesburg Country Club in Auckland Park. And when I met him, typical and true Madiba style, he said, "So young lady, what do you do?" And I told him, I shared that, you know, we co-founded with Tosi Mamela and I ran one of the top internationally aligned executive search companies. And I said, we're in the world of leadership. We work closely with the Mandela Foundation. We care about finding the Mandela kind of leaders that will help fulfill your vision for the country and this beautiful rainbow nation. And he said, leadership is one of the most powerful leverages and weapons you can use to change the world. He said, keep up your wonderful work and do it not only for South Africa, but for Africa and the world. And of course, fast forward 2017, I came to Harvard University. I did a second fellowship in 2018. And here I am, you know, grateful, very grateful for my African roots.
Yeah, look, we're very grateful for the work that you've also been doing. And we're going to speak a little bit about the work, including the podcast and the like. But I just want to hone in on what you're saying about, you know, leadership and having that moment with an encounter with the former head of state, Nelson Mandela. In often cases, leaders find themselves in situations where they question the authenticity, but also the effectiveness of their leadership, especially people that are sitting now having to navigate, and we always use this reference, a post-COVID environment where things have changed, leadership styles have to change. There's a new generation, Generation Z or even Generation Alpha that is coming into the workforce. And many leaders are questioning their authenticity, but also their effectiveness in being a leader. What do you think makes a good leader?
You know, I think leadership is often misunderstood. It's often confused with people in positions of power. And they're different. You know, people in power have authority. Their duty is to direct, protect, and maintain order. Leadership is something completely different. And we're all called out to lead. Anyone, anywhere, and any time can exercise fortified moral courage and leadership excellence. So it really is a call to action to each one of us to meet the moment, whether it be in our communities, our schools, our churches, our boardrooms. We're all called to lead. And to come back to your question around, you know, what makes good leader? I mean, that's a big question, a big conversation. But for me, leadership is the ability. It is not a position. It is an ability to analyze, energize, mobilize, galvanize, and harmonize a collective group towards a common goal. And if we think about that, so often, you know, you made the point, Faith, around authenticity. I think great leaders are incredibly authentic. You know, let's think about Mandela. Of course, we're celebrating his 105th birthday, but Mandela was incredibly authentic, and many great leaders. So I think so often we are aspiring to be something we think other people want us to be, whether they were parents that were shaping us, or our critics, or our bosses, or our, you know, colleagues. Leadership is about showing up and being authentically you, understanding who you are. And, you know, you talk about our childhood and our family and our stories of origin. That is where leadership begins. What is our origin story? What do we care about? What matters? And show up being authentically you. I think that's a big part. We could carry on, but I think authenticity and being true to what really matters to you in the world, because when you know, there are no masks, there are no dress rehearsals. It's simply about understanding who you are, understanding what you stand for, understanding what you care about, and showing up in a spirit of energizing and harmonizing a collective group towards a common goal.
But as we're taking a look at the space of leadership, you know, many people are in positions of power. Many heads of state are in positions of power. One would say Mandela was a 1 in a million, you know, and a few of the men who spent time incarcerated for the freedom and the democracy of South Africa. But those are 1 in a million men. When you take a gander at the world right now in the global community, do you think we've got more leaders or more people in powerful positions? And how is it that the people in powerful positions are actually not leaders? How do they get there?
Well, I think, you know, to say how many, I wouldn't even pretend to be able to try and predict that. But I think that there are people in powerful positions that get elected because of promises they make. And then there's a question, there's track record, and then it takes time. I mean, whether we're, you know, as a top internationally aligned executive search company, we would often be reporting to a cabinet minister or a board or a nomination committee around trying to identify the right kind of leader who would step into a position of power to meet a particular set of challenges for the moment in time. And how did we do that? We looked at past track record, we do competency-based profiling, we do 360-degree feedback. You know, we use the best methods possible to try and assess whether a person has that leadership capacity. And the truth is, as search consultants, you know, you need to get that right. And you know, I'm really happy to say that in more than 90% of cases, we did get that right. But I think, to come back to your question, Faith, I think we need certain systemic changes in the world. I think this world is very focused on short-term profit and gain. And I think that if we look at the big existential threats and challenges and opportunities, the world has radically changed. We're in a phase of unprecedented crisis, chaos, and conflict. And we have a new set of challenges. that are different in nature and form. We're living in an age where traditional, conventional, national thinking and popular nationalism cannot survive. If we think about the era we've come out of, valor and pride and purpose was about putting country over self. The world has changed. The challenges have changed. The threats to humanity have changed. If we think about the climate crisis, if we think about artificial intelligence, if we think about the godfather of AI, Geoffrey Hinton, who has recently stepped out of his position at Google so he can talk more freely about the threat of AI and robots and whether we have created, these algorithms where robots will soon, in 5 to 20 years, outsmart humanity. I mean, we are living with threats and challenges and opportunities that transcend our national borders. So the new way of thinking is about thinking about humanity over country and over self. It requires bigger and better thinking. It requires a new kind of thinking. And, Mandela, he transformed himself. He changed South Africa, a nation at war, but he galvanized the world. And he understood it was the interconnectedness of our humanity, Ubuntu, that really underpinned the basis, the philosophical and cultural basis of his leadership and how he exercised leadership every day of his life.
We can spend the entire day speaking about such leadership, but I know that also you've got your podcast, which is Leading Boldly into the Future. You've hosted an array of interesting people, people that, speak on leadership, people that practice leadership on a day-to-day basis. But if you could actually interview, especially with the times that we're living in right now, and anybody in the world who you believe is somebody that can actually champion the cause of leadership and effective leadership and teach the entire world how to be an effective leader, who would that person be?
Well, Faith, I mean, that's quite a tough question because there are a number of people I'd love to interview. I know that you were a Mandela Washington Fellow and had the great privilege of introducing former President Barack Obama. And by the way, we would love for Barack Obama to write the foreword to this book, Mandela's Leadership Blueprint, The Future of Leadership, because I truly believe Madiba's blueprint is the future of leadership. But I think if I had to pinpoint one person, I would go for Oprah Winfrey. I met Oprah briefly after one of her shows in Chicago when I was at the International Women Forum conference in Chicago. She actually came up and spoke to me briefly after the show. And in fact, the next day she was flying to Johannesburg to spend some time with Madiba and Graça Michelle. And I think the reason why I would choose Oprah, I mean, not only, Oprah, as we know, opened up her Leadership Academy for girls in Johannesburg, outside Johannesburg at Kenyon Clip. It was a pledge to Madiba. And it was very much inspired by her being from African roots, her love and respect for Madiba, and wanting to do something for girls like her in South Africa. And I think, so coming back to Oprah, I think Oprah is an incredibly authentic leader. I think she has effected a lot of change in the world in a very courageous way. She had the privilege of spending 10 days with Madiba in his home, making a pledge, honoring him, very connected to South Africa. But she also brings this global perspective, and she herself exercises leadership in a very authentic, courageous way. She's not afraid to be an outlier. She's not afraid to say the uncomfortable things. And I think she does that in her daily life. And I think that's a big part of her success, by the way.
Yeah, no, she's definitely, and I think she's actually in Johannesburg of recent. So it's quite ironic that you should actually speak about her. Really an impressive woman who's been able to say, even as you're saying, the uncomfortable truth, which I think in many times we actually need to be able to hear the uncomfortable truth. But this world of ours, and I was making reference to it, is changing so much. And now it's not only just about effective leadership, but it's being able to lead an intergenerational mix, right? So you're going to have people that are 55 plus within the working environment, and those that are about 21 years of age within the working environment. All of those individuals, you have to be able to lead, and they have to trust in your leadership. How do you speak to the TikTok generation, as I call them, and
Yeah.
also speak to, you know, the Facebook generation or the generation that came before social media, because they all need leadership, but they also need leadership that speaks and is tailor-made to the way that they're able to receive responses and the way that they're able to receive guidance. So how do we start with intergenerational leadership, which I think a lot of corporate structures are struggling with right now?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think you raise a really good point. I think the first place to start is to analyze and understand these different generations and what their core motivations are, and also their means of communication. I mean, you talk about the TikTok generation, you know, trying to talk to Gen Z on, you know, perhaps Facebook or LinkedIn, you know. So I think it's firstly analyzing those different generations. What are their core motivators? There's a lot of research that gives us those kinds of insights. And then look for that aspect of leadership that is relevant to them. So talk to them around issues that matter to them. Let me give you a practical example. One of the people that are part of our co-founders in this global Mandela leadership movement for change is Harvard Kennedy School Pearl director, John Della Volpe, a dear friend of mine. He wrote a book called Fight, how Gen Z are using their fear and passion to save America. Their passion and fear, actually, that's his subline, to save America. And, you know, listening to John, and his podcast is coming out soon, listening to him and listening and reading his book, it gives me incredible encouragement and hope, because Gen Z, being of a different generation, means that they're at a different stage of their own development. They have, perhaps they're not as fearful of losing as much comfort in life, because, you know, older generations have more material things to lose. But this generation have the fear of losing, you know, their future. I mean, it's, you know, if humanity doesn't survive in this climate crisis, they don't have a future. So I think it's about analyzing, understanding different generations. What is their agenda? What are their motivations? And what are their means of communication? And in leadership, we say we need to meet people where they are. So understand where they are, understand their issues, understand their fears, and then reach out and talk to them in a language and through a medium that's relevant to them. And I think we need to do that for different generations. And by the way, the other thing I would say is that even across these different generations, there are common denominators. And you know, the truth is, as an older generation, we do care about the future of our children and grandchildren. Yes, we may have more materialistic things to lose. And yes, there may be this kind of, you know, I don't want to give up that sacrifice of some of those comforts, but I do care about whether my children and grandchildren will survive. And I do care about the planet they will inherit. So I think even though there are these distinct differences with different agenda, different means of communication, there are common denominators. And I think part of what great leaders do is that they understand the differences, they meet people where they are, but then they also find those common denominators to unite and ignite.
You know, you're speaking here a little bit about the future, and of course this generation believes, or the Generation Z or Generation Alpha believes, that the future is literally within their grasp, because they've got a very invincible kind of approach to life, the fearless leadership approach to life, or the fearlessness approach to life. But we have to look at leadership of the future. And a lot of times when we're speaking about leadership of the future, it requires us to pivot a little bit from the way that we've been doing things traditionally. And that pivoting can become a very uncomfortable exercise, one would say. As we're navigating this future of ours, which is technologically uncertain, that is fast-paced, that is moving in speeds that we've never seen, unprecedented speeds, one might say, to be able to be a leader of foresight and to have a leader that thinks of the future is hard. What kind of a leader should have that foresight?
Well, I think foresight, and I know that, you know, with the Stellenbosch Business Institute, I think they've correctly identified foresight as one of the most important skills in the 21st century. Foresight enables us to take a step back, to look at the big picture, to understand these radically and rapidly changing moves and trends in the world, these mega trends, and then educate and inform ourselves about what do these mean and how do we connect the dots. So it's not just about looking after comfort today, it's about anticipating the threats, the challenges, and the opportunities that these mega trends present. And I think, you know, great leadership is about that ability. It's the ability to analyze, it's the ability to connect those dots, and then it's the ability to have that fortified moral courage to make difficult decisions, you know, that may require sacrifice, but in order to protect, you know, the vision for the future and future generations, there are trade-offs in life. And so I think having that foresight is critically important. It's understanding the macro picture, the mega trends, and connecting the dots. And it's also about having bigger and better thinking. What do I mean by that? I think we need to expand our current intelligence types beyond conventional IQ and perhaps emotional intelligence, which we've learned a lot more about. You know, if I look at Mandela, he had 10 intelligence types. And it's about expanding our existing neural pathways, but also developing new neural pathways so that we can process data and information to understand these big issues that we haven't had to deal with before. And some of those intelligence types would be practical intelligence, taking complexity and making it relevant and accessible. It's physical intelligence. How do we show up? How do we energize ourselves? It's emotional, it's social intelligence. It's understanding. I know you too, Faith, are an advocate of social cohesion advocate. You were for Department of Arts and Culture. Social intelligence is how do we understand and navigate our social patterns of behavior so that we can galvanize and harmonize people within a group. It's cultural intelligence, it's environmental intelligence, and it's existential and spiritual intelligence. So we need to expand our current neural pathways to expand our intelligence and related competencies, but we also need to raise the level of our intelligence. You know, there's a wonderful Harvard professor, Bob Keegan, who did a lot of work on adult development theory, and he spoke about human beings having 5 stages of development. And in fact, the research he did, he found that amongst adults, 58% of the global population have what he calls a socialized mindset, where our entire identity is defined by our specific tribe, a narrow definition. So whether it be I'm a Zulu girl, or I'm a Xhosa, or I'm a South African, or I'm an American, or, you know, whatever it is, but these people are specifically defined, and often that's where you get these conflicts between Republicans and Democrats, between different parties, because they're so identified within their tribe. Their whole socialized being and identity is defined by that tribe, and it's hard for them to step out of that tribe and look objectively from the outside in, which is what Keegan calls a self-authored mind. And that, he says, 35% of the population have learned to do that. Yes, I love my tribe, but I can be objective about them. This is what I love about them. This is where I think we have gaps and things we can amend. And then Keegan says that there's 1% of the global population, and he talks about Mandela being in that, and what he calls a self-transformed mind. So this is a higher level of thinking that says, I'm not going to define my being in the world by whether I'm belong to this tribe or this country or this political party or this church. My tribe is the human race. I'm going to look at the human race as a tribe, yes, and my identity is defined by my humanity. And I think that is part of the great gift of Ubuntu and the cultural gift that we got and learned in Africa, this interconnectedness of humanity. And I think that enables us, that culture, that philosophy enables us to develop what Keegan calls the self-transformed mind. It's an ability to identify our worth as a human being, not as a member of a particular tribe.
Sure. And, you know, there's so many offshoots that we can go on to this one as you're speaking about, you know, a self-transformed mind. a lot of times people that come in, and I'm going to use, and I'm going to label on what you're saying about the former head of state, Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was first a lawyer, and then, of course, then he was unctioned into position of being somebody within the ANC. Then he had to go against the very same ANC, go into the MK to fight for democracy. What he believed, he was labeled a terrorist, right? He was labeled an actual terrorist, and then obviously spending the more than 20 years or 27 years incarcerated in that sense. But he died for, or he didn't die, but he lived for a cause. And he was willing to go through 7 years of incarceration for a cause. That kind of leadership, that leadership that comes from humble beginnings, not a lot of global exposure. He didn't have the Harvard business schools. He didn't have the Oxford. He didn't study in that space. He had his environment and he made do with what was in the environment, and yet he became that kind of leader. How do we cultivate that kind of thinking? Is it learned? Can we learn it? Can we also adopt it so that indeed we are able to be leaders that expand beyond just our self-looking or self-preserving selves?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. And he didn't, as a child, have that exposure. But Madiba he was schooled by Methodist missionaries that opened up his mind to some of the international thinking. These were missionaries that came from abroad. Very importantly, he had his elders in the Utembu tribe. And that's what I say, this whole notion and concept of Ubuntu, of the interconnectedness of our humanity, that a victory for one is a victory for all. And, death of one is death for all, because we cannot sustain our success at the expense of another human being. And I think Madiba learned that in the, with the Utembu tribe, with his adopted father, King Yungantaba, after his father died when he was young and grew up. But the elders of that tribe taught Madiba how to exercise that kind of leadership. So when you ask the question, and the fact that he had a cause, he listened to the stories of the powerful and courageous men and women that came before him and fought for their freedom against British colonialism, etc. So, I think we can cultivate it. I think we get teachers in many different forms. The research shows, and I think this is also part of the future of leadership, it's also about a change for academia and how do we learn in our formal institutions. We know 10% of learning happens in the classroom, 20% happens from our peers, mentors, and coaches, and 70% is experiential learning. And so the research shows that there's a different way of learning. And if I think about Madiba, he had mentors and elders that taught him through story, through the way they exercise leadership, through the cultural philosophy, through the way they, the king practiced resolving conflict within his own community. He also had the influence of some of the international thinking, but I think we can learn it, we can develop it, and we can cultivate it through those mentors and teachers in our lives. And often, Faith, these are teachers that believe in us. This is a grandmother. This is an aunt, an uncle, a family friend who is a good person, who is a change maker in the world, who is courageous, and who shares those stories and those lessons and those philosophies. And many of them have come onto our podcast and share those stories. These are people who've learned from humble, everyday heroes that have taught them. So I think we can cultivate it. I think it begins with family. It begins with our communities that we grow up in. And I think that, it's about tapping into that learning experience. I think that, like I said, I think Mandela's leadership blueprint is the future of leadership. I think there are things that we can learn from different parts of the world. For so long, people on the African continent and other parts of the world have really held the Western world up and very, almost put them on a pedestal. But it was the late Steve Biko who said the great powers of the world have done much to give the world a military and an industrial look. The great gift has still to come from Africa to give the world a more human face. Nelson Mandela and the culture of Ubuntu gave the world a more human face.
You know, it's that kind of leadership that requires an element of altruism. So how then do we start, even within practically being able to implement it within our organizations? You know, organizations and work life has got about 10, 12 hours that you've got at a time where you get to spend time with your colleagues, where you get to practice and activate this kind of leadership, the altruistic, the transitional leadership and the like. But sometimes it's very difficult to do so when the concern is about the bottom line. The bottom line leadership, that's what is imperative. So how then do you start having that bottom line in mind, but also understanding that the cause is bigger than our own? It's about the bottom line, but we've got a cause bigger than our own.
Well, you know, first of all, I just want to go back to your earlier question. I think we find our cause. We started this conversation around what makes great leaders. I think it's about being authentic and true. And I think it starts with our origin story as children. Mandela identified his cause at a young age. Most of us do. Most of us, if we go back to our origin story and understand, who am I? What do I care about? What matters to me? What do I want to be remembered for when I leave Mother Earth? And so I think we find our cause often going back to truly understand who we are, what matters to us. Often that defines that cause. We can execute that, whether it be in the corporate boardroom, whether it be in our communities, our schools, our churches, whatever it is. And I think that the cause is there. That's about exploring self. I think coming back to the world of business and the bottom line, the world of business is changing radically. You know, I've interviewed in our podcast, who are also co-founders of this change, the former CEO and chairman of Best Buy, a New York Stock Exchange business that was going under, but using a triple bottom line, not just financial reporting, but social, environmental, and financial. The triple bottom line was able to turn around Best Buy and drive the share price up fivefold in 5 years. So even the world of business is changing. Businesses that grasp and understand that being driven by a noble purpose is what contributes not only to the financial bottom line, but to the triple bottom line. And if they neglect the social and environmental factors, because the world is changing so radically, because Generation Z are their employees, their future talent in this war for talent, their customers. So, you know, as the world and the demography of the world changes, business leaders, captains of industry and corporate chiefs also understand that business is needing a new brand of capitalism. It's no longer about shareholder wealth as the primary purpose of business. It's about delivering for multiple stakeholders. It's about impact investing. And the world is shifting. The world of business is shifting. You know, investors, the investment community is changing, and impact investment funds are growing in significant importance and popularity.
It speaks significantly about purpose leadership, you know,
Yeah.
and leading for purpose. But many people, as it is now, and struggle to even think or even internalize on what their purpose is.
Yeah.
Because you can't be a purposeful leader without having to have discovered your own purpose. How do we champion and open that door? I often say that a lot of us are even afraid to spend time with ourselves because we're going to be afraid of what we see and who we meet. And purposeful leadership requires that kind of reflection and introspection. How do we find that purpose?
Well, I think you've answered the question. I think, you know, often we are afraid of who we meet in the mirror, but leadership, exercising leadership takes courage. And we need to have the courage to take a look in the mirror. We need to have the courage to spend time with ourselves for that reflection and introspection. And, you know, Madiba himself said that there were times when he missed the quietness of being in prison, of time to think, of time with himself. And so I think you've answered the question, and that we do need to have the courage. That is a choice, Faith. And the choice is, I have a finite time on Mother Earth. How do I want to spend that time? what is the biggest risk to me? That I don't have the courage to look in the mirror and show up with who I authentically am, or get to the end of my life thinking about what I could have and should have been. That's a personal choice.
And it does require an element of self-reflection and insight as well. And if we have to take some of these learnings, and especially from the former head of state, Nelson Mandela, and we're able to implement it even in our work-life environment, he was also a very assertive leader. He was a leader who was not afraid to speak his mind. And many oftentimes, Nelson Mandela is often painted as this almost lamb-like figure. You know, he loved people, but he's often painted as this lamb-like figure. But the very same Nelson Mandela's, the lamb-like figure, is the same Nelson Mandela who had a gun in his pocket when he was going through the CODESA negotiations, because he did not know the outcome of it and he was ready to take up arms. So he had an assertiveness to him. How do leaders become and exercise that assertiveness, but effectively, so that they get the work done, they're able to champion the cause, but don't isolate people in the main?
Well, you know, I don't think it's a coincidence that Madiba's name was Ruli Shlahla, troublemaker, you know, and a good troublemaker, what, you know, people would call a good troublemaker. I think, you know, assertiveness in and of itself is such an important competence and skill. And I think so often, you know, the flip side, assertiveness is kind of the optimal middle of between submissive and being aggressive. So sometimes, and, you know, here's the thing, Faith, I mean, quite often, I think when people show up, you know, Mandela did learn to contain his annoyance and irritation, anger, but, you know, he was assertive. I think what made his assertiveness easier for people, even if people didn't always like what he did or like what he said, was that Mandela had a very clear moral compass. He understood what his true north was. He had a single purpose, which was for the freedom of all South Africans. And he had a very clear moral compass. He understood. And most of us do know what doing and saying and doing the right thing is. It's whether we have that self-discipline to manage these kind of dramas we all have. We have triggers, we have hungers, we have dramas, but that takes self-discipline. And I think that being assertive is about being clear about your purpose, being clear about what you stand for, being true to your moral compass, having the discipline to practice that, and sometimes say and do the unpopular things. I think that is exercising leadership. And you know what I found interesting, Faith, is that often Franklin D. Roosevelt once said, people think I give them a hard time. It's not true. I tell them the truth, and the truth gives them a hard time. And I think very often being assertive is about saying and doing the right things for the right reasons, but without malice and revenge. I think that's very often, that's the distinguishing factor.
Do you find that women, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's globally, rise to that occasion of leadership, where even assertiveness and having the truth make people uncomfortable manifests itself? Where do women find themselves within this realm of navigating effective leadership?
You know, it's such a good question. When Tsotsi and I still ran Mandela, Pratt and Associates in South Africa, and we you know, worked all over Africa and internationally. But we did and published the first qualitative woman on board research in South Africa. And it was to get behind the numbers, to understand the numbers and answer the research question, is there a business case for women on boards? Will they enhance board decision-making? And if so, what are the strategies for women on boards? And it was a very insightful piece of research, in the sense that quite often women can be assertive, but if they're assertive in the way men are being assertive, they brand it as being aggressive. And what really came out very strongly was for women to use what makes us uniquely feminine, which is our kind of, you know, we have that feminine touch, if you like, but to use that in a way that is kind and supportive, but that doesn't compromise being assertive and strong and clear-minded and assertive about, you know, what one thinks is the right thing. And I think that, to answer your question, I think so many amazing women leaders have come through and come through strongly. And I think many of them, they have a core belief in themselves. And I think, you know, the other thing I would say, Faith, the better we know ourselves, the more willing we are to look in the mirror, to understand who we are, warts and all, and to appreciate our strengths and work on those gaps that we want to improve in ourselves, the more confident we are in exercising leadership and being assertive. And it's not about being aggressive. It's just about being clear, being firm, being strong. The person I love to quote is my good friend, Advocate Thuli Madonsela, who has this incredible, the first time I met Thuli, I mean, she just had this incredible, gracious way, powerful woman, but can I pour you tea? I mean, she was the one pouring the tea in the room, like, you know, being this gracious, sweet, kind person that she is. But let me tell you, don't ever as we know, I mean, her fortitude, her assertiveness, but she has this quiet, gentle way of presenting it, but unwavering in her purpose, her principles, and her what she believes to be the right thing to do.
I swear to you, Anne, if the time allowed us, we would spend the entire day speaking about the type of leadership that is needed in a very dynamic and a forever changing world. And one may say, in a world that becomes very fast, self-centered. And unfortunately, we are out of time a little bit with that one, but I have to thank you. I really do for your words, for your insights, for your wisdom. In 30 seconds, if you can just give us a nugget of what do we take home this afternoon or morning or evening, depending where we are in the world, to help us know that we are on the right path. How do I know I'm on the right path?
I think knowing we're on the right path is going back to what's true within, to look at the mirror, to understand what really matters to us in the world, and to really appreciate the African gift of Ubuntu, that it is the interconnectedness of humanity, that bigger and better thinking, that will make this world a more loving, lasting, and better world for all.
And Pratt, it's absolute pleasure to have had you at this for this session of LeaderSHIFT. Of course, it is courtesy of the Stellenbosch Business Institute. I wish I could spend the entire day with you. I can't. We have to leave it here for this particular conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, you're amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us once again. Remember, this happens every single month. Do pay attention to us, because next month we've got a similar conversation as well. Global leaders, wonderful insights, people that genuinely care about our global community, but care about you, ensuring that you navigate the path of leadership in a way that makes you an effective leader with foresight in mind. Remember one thing, you can't steer the ship if, number one, you do not have the vision for the ship, but also you don't know where to go. And more than anything else, if you don't have the right people that are leading you. So make sure that you surround yourself with the right crowd so that you're able to match that true north. And until we talk again, have a fantastic rest of your day. Remember the leadership within, and you're perfect as the leader that you are. Until next time, goodbye.